Ghanaian experience. And so I wanted to ask you, Bright, help us understand this from your perspective and offer some guidance to us Guyanese who are, we're a small island state who susceptible to the Dutch disease, maybe not so strong institutions, trying to shift our industrial policy to agriculture and to better support education. Give us your thought from that perspective. And again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Terence. My presentation is still loading. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, wonderful. My presentation is still loading. Unfortunately, it looks very slow, maybe a minute or so before it does. So maybe I'll use this time for the preliminary pleasantries. First of all, I'm very delighted and honored that Guyana Business Journal and the Caribbean Policy Consortium decided to invite me to share with you a much more non-Guyanese perspective. What I've intended to do with this little time that I have is to provide a much more global framework within which we can look at some of the more compelling issues, some of which have already come up, some very compelling presentations so far. So it's a more wide-ranging kind of touch on a lot of things very quickly, but try and weave a thread through it. And it's that thread that I think will be very important in terms of ideas that will leave people that have decided to spend all these many minutes with us. So while the presentation loads up, I would say a little bit about Imani. We are a think tank based in Accra. We initially were very focused on Ghana, but over time we realized that a lot of the issues that confront developing countries in the global south, are very similar, and therefore we need to take a more global perspective in the way that we look at these things. So we become more comparative in the way that we do our analysis, and some of the work that I'll be sharing therefore will not be only Ghana-centric. I'll crave for a little bit of time, just maybe a little bit above the allocated time, so we can touch on some of the themes that have popped up, but from a global perspective. So the upload has been done and it's processing. I think it's not too long ago and Colin did mention that Ghana was being celebrated around the world for very similar reasons to Guyana. In 2007, we discovered oil. Having discovered oil and, therefore our credit having improved, we also discovered the Eurobond market. So two things happened at the same time. We discovered oil and we discovered the Eurobond market. And in the 3 years subsequent, we moved into production. We fast-tracked development of the oil fields. And in 2010, the first oil fields went live. In the subsequent period, a number of additional fields have come on board. Fascinatingly, there's not been a major discovery in Ghana now for more than 6 years. So it tells you that you can have a boom period, and then you can have so my slides are now up, and perhaps you can add it to the screen.
Yeah. Here we are.
Wonderful. So what it does tell you very clearly is that you can have a boom period of massive oil discoveries. So you discover Stabroek, then you discover Lisa, then you discover this and that, and then you can have a very long drought in which discoveries just don't happen, because some of this stuff is stochastic, some of this stuff is random in terms of what fields you discover and don't discover. So Ghana had this celebratory moment in which it was a big story, like Colin has pointed out. And then, as most of you that are familiar with the continent, Africa, that's what I mean, I know it's been quite a very few devastating years for Ghana. It defaulted on its international loans, and things have not been so shiny. As far as my talk is concerned, I'm here to discuss institutional imagination. I'm here to try and convince you that it's much more, shall I say, flexible from a point of view of the cognitive constructs that we need to deal with when thinking about how to advance this potential bonanza that Guyana has had. And Roberto Ongar is an academic at Harvard that I like a lot. And he likes to try and convince us that because institutions have an inertial content, there's inertia in institutions, we tend to think of them as, received from the mind of God. But the truth of the matter is that institutions are very flexible. And what I'll be trying to show you is that around the world, there have been very different ways of trying to do some of the things that you're talking about. Making sure that Guyana doesn't get cheated by multinational oil corporations, check. There's a ton of ways you can go about and do that. Making sure that redistribution happens effectively, check. There's a ton of ways in which you can go around doing that. So that flexibility in terms of thinking of how the institutions work is very important. That also means, of course, that there's no absolute best practice. This is a quick overview of different countries in the world and the mechanisms that they use. In Guyana, you use a royalty and a profit sharing model. In some places, it's more production sharing in its more traditional sense. In some places, it's joint venture driven. In some places, it's more concessions based. There's so many different ways in which you can organize your natural resources, including in petroleum. And so recognizing that, it doesn't really matter how developed the country is, how not developed the country is, you still have heterogeneity is very important. So there are countries that are fairly advanced like Norway, but that has institutions that are fairly similar to those like Brazil or Suriname. And then there are countries that are very advanced like Canada or the US, which have systems that are very similar to, say, in Ghana. So we have to be very careful in terms of our understanding of what it is to come up with a best practice model. Even before you start producing, you will see that there is considerable variety in terms of how you structure the actual contracting and licensing process around the world. And therefore, when you look at fiscal burdens, so I saw that in Guyana, there's been a huge debate about how the first field, which is Stabroek, how the fields that were found in Stabroek, the royalty arrangements was too small, 2%. And people have talked about the fact that, Guyana was cheated. But yes, it is true that, 2% is very low for royalties. But if you go around the world, there's a significant variety in terms of what the tax rate looks like, in terms of what the royalty looks like. And I will say that, and I'll say a bit more about that as I move forward. It's very important that you don't obsess over any specific fiscal number. When it comes to the legal structuring of these deals, it's also important that you recognize that there is massive variability in fiscal stability, for instance. This is a mechanism by which the big companies try to prevent being taken by surprise. So they try to make sure that in the agreements, they have stability of provisions. Now, even how you do that, there are hybrid mechanisms, there are limited mechanisms, there are mechanisms that allow you to look at specific indicators and when they show up, etc., etc. So as Guyana continues to do more licensing, there is still room for civil society. There's still room for people like the Policy Consortium and the media, as well as thought leaders like yourself, parents, to continue to push on this issue around what is the creative content of some of these structuring. Yes, it's fine to have a model agreement for people to have predictability of how things work, but within model agreements, the parameters that can shift, especially in relation to fiscal stability, can still manifest really amazing variability. So there's a lot of thinking that's still left to be done about how you do when it comes to the remaining resources that are in the ground. And if you look at the other countries and the way they've done it, you'll be surprised that for an industry that is seen as very standardized around the world, that this variety keeps popping up everywhere you go. So there's a lot of creative thinking that is still left to be done when it comes to structuring these contracts at every level, not just in production, but in marketing, etc. Another thing is what I said earlier, which is that don't obsess over single numbers. Don't take the royalty number and say, oh, it's 2%. Okay, now we have a new regime, which is 10%. That's slightly better, or it's 20%, or tax rate is this, or profit sharing rate is this. That is not the way to do it because it's a multi-dial system. The different indicators work together to create a final output. So royalty is important, but so also is the tax rate, so also is the profit sharing rate, so is your cost recovery model. So there are so many different indicators that go into this mechanism that by doing the dials right, setting the dials right, it's a bit like flying an aircraft, right? Setting those dials right and making sure you're doing it well can lead to outcomes that are much more different than you thought before. So that's very important to bear in mind. And like I've said, the fiscal instruments are really diverse. You can tune them and you can redial them, you can shift them. But then that then implies that you have to have modeling, which is where you come in, Terence. The mathematicians have a role to play here. You need to have these really rigorous modeling exercises where you say, okay, if you change this, this is how it affects all the other parameters. And then when that happens, when there's a change in parliament, there's a change in cabinet, you don't wait till you have a whole debate before, because you can simply go into that model and tweak a couple of parameters and say, here are some of the outputs, and have a much more structured debate within civil society and within academia about the impact of specific policy changes. So that kind of modeling should be done in civil society, should be done in academia. You should make sure that when they change parameters within the regimes, whether it's fiscal regime or legal regime, you know immediately how that will affect the different outputs that are important to you. And that also means that you take a whole of government and whole society approach, because it's a system. It's not just, production. It's not just taxation. It's not just local content. It's not just linkages into the rest of the economy. It's all of these things together. Talent has a role to play in the rest of it. But without the modeling, without the ability to connect one to the other, and without people like yourself and others on this call having that broad perspective of how the interconnections work, it makes dialogue difficult. It makes it hard for you to challenge whether or to debate whether a particular fiscal policy or a particular legal policy makes sense or not. It follows then, if we think along these lines, that states take the amount of money, the absolute amount of money that goes to the government is not the only thing to obsess over. There is just often in the broad media too much emphasis on how much the government gets overall. And you can look at it and see that, if you take a couple of countries in Africa, it's not necessarily the ones where the government gets the most money that are the best governed. And that is very interesting just looking at that on the screen. Some of the best governed countries, some of the strongest countries in the region are also the ones where the government doesn't get as much out of the oil. But remember, back to my model, the government may not be the only key player in this regard. There are other factors at play. So you have to look in and think through how are the benefits distributed broadly in economic terms, in employment terms, and in other variables like technology transfer, et cetera, and how do those weave together to create a truly transformative outcome. So we come to Guyana, and I guess the specials in Guyana is that you are a very small country with a very small population, so the oil wealth distributed per capita is overwhelming. And most of you must have seen this graph that suggests that on a per capita basis, you are now truly, truly remarkable as a country. Now, that
is the problem. On a per capita basis, it seems, but the systems that you just described,
yes.
The comments from the comments in the thing there, you say, please ask your guests what are the dials for Guyana, because we're not seeing this output that you.
I'll get to that very shortly. So here is the big picture now for Guyana. You get 2% of the money, and that is on the top. You take 2% of the top. You cream 2% of the top. And then after everything has happened, costs have been taken care of, etc., some profit remains, and then you take 50%. In a way, that was for the biggest find. For the new find, you get 10% of the top, or you cream 10% of the top, and then after all the costs have been taken care of, you get 50% of the profit. What that means is very simple. It means that, first of all, in terms of competitiveness, you are still one of the most competitive destinations, but that's from the investor's point of view. So from the investor's point of view, you are great. They want to come and do more business there. Okay. The second point, though, is that a lot now relies on how effective you will be from an institutional point of view of monitoring the cost. Because without knowing the cost effectively, you don't know what the profit is, right? And you are sharing the profit, and that is the biggest chunk of your return, sharing the profit. So it means, therefore, that the profit calculation, the profit modeling becomes extremely interesting. And already you are fighting about costs. You already have a situation where
I was about to tell you that this is a big place in the past and in the current.
Indeed, you're already fighting over costs. So that already tells me that there is room in Guyana to learn from all of us who've had to be dealing with this cost issue for many, many years around the world. And we know the issues, right? Base erosion, cost inflation, profit attrition. What does that mean? What that means is it's very simple. These big multinationals that are, mining your oil or drilling your oil, they have global operations, and they have the ability to shift certain services elsewhere where the taxes are low, and bring services into Guyana when they think your taxes are high, or when they think the profit sharing dynamic means, therefore, that they need to inflate costs. Now, inflating costs is a very, very technical dance. Now, that technical dance requires a number of important parameters, which I'll try and mention a couple of them. We don't just have the time to delve into this, but I'll mention a couple of them, and that's important. And it ultimately leads to a situation where you have less profit oil. If you have less profit oil, Guyana has less money. If you have too little money, it ends up that all the nice, beautiful plans around sustainability and the rest of it can't be implemented because you can't finance them. It's as simple as that. So first case study, Congo. one country in Africa that a lot of people confuse with the other Congo. So there's a much bigger Congo that's like maybe 100 million people that's next door. Probably the richest country in the world per capita when it comes to natural resources generally. But this Congo is a smaller country next to it. And sometimes we distinguish them by saying Congo Brazzaville and then Congo Kinshasa. Congo Kinshasa being the big one. So this Congo Brazzaville has been producing oil for a very long time. And one of the things that they've discovered is that almost always retrospective audits show that the multinationals inflate their costs. And there are tax concessions that they shouldn't have got, that they get. And part of the challenge that we've seen is because the overall process of how you set it up to do the audit means it takes too many years. So by the time you discover that, there's been, this cost inflation or under declaration, it becomes a historical matter. Records are not clear. There's room for a lot of dispute. You really never can use retrospective management to get money back. And the reason why that is so critical, that point about retrospective management, is that there's actually a good way to fix it. The way to fix it is to have proactive management. Every month, the big multinational producers of oil in Guyana, like ExxonMobil, CNOOC, and the rest, and both those that are operators, like ExxonMobil, and those that are just co-venturers, like Hess, they send reports to the ministry as well as to the regulator. Now, that data is shared with key government agencies, particularly the Revenue Authority. The most important thing you can build is a proactive, predictive variance detector so that when that data comes in and they put it in the models, they begin to see if there's a reason for them to do a proactive audit. Without that kind of mechanism, you wait for 2 years, then 3 years, then you audit them for 10 years back. It's not an efficient way of preventing base erosion, cost inflation, all of these things that I've talked about. So that's a very important point. The other thing is to have risk-based controls that are intelligent to the way that business is done in the industry. And here I'll give an example of Ghana. So in Ghana, we have multiple fields and we have multiple blocks. The blocks don't always correspond to the field. Basically, what we license to the investor is not always where all the oil is found. Sometimes there are multiple blocks and some of the oil cross boundaries, etc. That can lead to a situation where, for the big companies, they can have fiscal consolidation and shift costs across the different projects. So when they shift costs across the different projects, it leads to a situation where profit for a particular producing field is lower than it should be. And so we introduced this term called ring fencing to try and prevent that. Unfortunately, the law itself was outmoded, and the law required ring fencing to be done at block level rather than field level. So we had to update that. But that's learning on our feet very rapidly. By that time, a lot of money had already gone under the bridge. So how does Guyana get smart? By understanding these kinds of things, by having this ability to have an international advisory network of people all over the world who've seen this before, who've done this before, that can help them to build a proactive system. That's very critical. You can't do it all of certain in Guyana, no matter all the expertise you have, because some of this stuff is experiential. You have to have experienced it to understand it. You look at the US system, and the way the US system is designed, because a lot of the US system is based on corporate tax. They don't like all this royalty stuff and that. So corporate tax is the big thing. How you make your profit, we take money out of it. But that also means that we have to really, really audit your costs very effectively. Auditing your costs very effectively means we need to understand your technological setup, how you actually operate. And so you see that in the US system, it goes all the way down when it comes to the guides that they provide to tax inspectors. It goes all the way down to making specific determinations around production technologies and its implication on tax. Can Guyana get to that level? Why not? That knowledge is out there. It's just a matter of determination. And that all these kind of best practice controls are not magic. Other countries have done it. There are people close to it who have fought battles. You can build, think of it like an artificial intelligence, large language model, where you bring in all of these pieces all over around the world to make sure that you generate outputs that are intelligent, proactive, and predictive. Now, I will touch on with the last few minutes that I've got on some key things that are not there in Guyana right now, or are there in a very inchoate form, and which you then need to improve. So I call that the situational gap analysis. One obvious point is to make a determination whether you want to continue to receive your share of the returns in oil or in money. It may look simple. I mean, do we take it in oil or do we take it in money? But actually, it turns out that there are a lot of interesting things that can come out depending on the choice you make. One of the things that can come out if you decide to use oil to get your share in oil, actually as opposed to the money, is that you can collateralize it for additional money. And there are ways in which that can be beneficial, but also very risky. So we've seen that happen in countries like Nigeria, because they take their returns, they take it in oil, or their share of output is taken in oil. We've seen some of it happening in Chad in ways that are not always very pleasant, but the case studies are there. Remember, though, that you are dealing in a situation of high volumes. You are projecting about 1 million barrels a day very soon. That's because you have high producing fields. At that large volumes scale, or that scale of large volumes, distributional effects are very complex, etc. But you don't have a particular problem. It's a problem that you will begin to have very soon when these oil fields are not as prolific, and which we are learning in Africa is very critical. In fact, it's so critical that it's one of the entry points to have Guyanese businesses become involved in actual production. So you're not entirely dependent on foreign companies. And that is this whole thing we call marginality. You have some shallow fields, shallow blocks, or blocks in shallow water. Now, blocks in shallow water literally just means that it's cheaper to produce and you need less advanced technology. Kawawan is a very good discovery, or semi-discovery, because they're not going to, they shut it down. But all that part of the acreage where you have shallow water, where you've made a discovery already, even if it's not a commercial discovery, all of that field is available now to start to think in terms of how do we get marginal producers involved. Companies in Guyana who don't have advanced technology, don't have a lot of money now, can begin to be prepared to start to play in shallow water. Nigeria waited too long before they started doing this. And by the time that they were dealing with marginality, time was already not on their side. You can start now. The other thing you can also begin to think about is that when you think of marginality and concepts like that, is to distinguish between project economics and social economics. Project economics is just to look at the numbers in the context of the project alone. That almost always leads you to not getting involved as a country. Your people think it's too risky, we can't find the money. When you look at it in terms of social economics as a whole, what are the tax concessions that are available, what are the technology transfer agreements that can be done, etc., there's much more creativity for what can happen in terms of your people getting involved. The other thing you don't have is you don't have the mechanism that links the output, the money that you make as a country, the fiscal take, to dynamics in the market. So, for instance, when oil prices change dramatically, it doesn't really change your fiscal situation in Guyana. You want to think about that very strongly. You also want to think about a national oil company. You've been talking about that for a long time now. I'm not too clear what that debate is at, what at our present point that debate is at. But the key thing to recognize is that almost all the big oil producing companies, the global south, do have national oil companies. National oil companies tend to reflect resource overdependence, which what that means is that the stronger the national oil company, typically, also the more dependent that economy is on the natural resource or the oil. And so you have to bear that in mind as you structure it. There are also national oil companies that become a problem. They become an albatross around your neck. They incur debt, and that debt becomes the national debt. So there are huge fiscal implications for having a national oil company. My advice, and this is the only big idea I'll leave you with in this presentation. My advice is that have a national oil company, but that national oil company should not focus on upstream production. It should focus on linkages across the oil services chain. So it should be more focused on the services that are going into the oil fields and that are leading to production, marketing, and the rest than it is in actual upstream production in the beginning. And it should be embedded in such a way that it can help with cost control. Because what happens is that it provides competition, which is sovereign competition, for some of the service delivery. That makes it very difficult for these big companies to lie about how much is being produced. That will also be how you create the linkage to your sovereign wealth fund, which is going to be a big deal as you continue to design that. And you have to be aware of all the case studies that we know from Papua New Guinea and others about how not to do this, etc., which I don't have the time to go into. And already, Dr. Ram has talked about this whole thing about green and climate. You have to remember that it's really critical that you remember that it is indeed a fact that the green transition will create pressure, and therefore decarbonization in the fields is going to be a thing. The question is it going to be done by the same companies that are benefiting from your oil, or is all the decarbonization going to be done by creative companies in Guyana that can do that decarbonization and the hydrogen production and all of these ancillary activities? And how do you link that to your national wealth strategy and your sovereign wealth strategy? And how do you link that to everything else? Too much to talk about, too little time, but I hope I've given you a flavor.
I know you've given us a really wonderful flavor. And first off, let me say thank you, because I think that it's precisely, what you've just given us is the sort of way in which we're hoping that we can, we have a sort of thinking that ideas matter, and they really do matter profoundly in our context. And quite frequently, we're simply not being as imaginative enough as we ought to be. And maybe I'll take this moment to bring Professor Brian in to kind of, I know we've gone way beyond the time. The board has been filled with questions. We will have to do this again. That's clear to me that we will have to do this again. Let me thank you, and let me ask Professor Brian to come in and give us a sense of what he's heard today. And we'll try to maybe just have one question where everyone can kind of offer a closing remark, because we've gone, I think, about 30 minutes over, but perfectly fine. I think this was well worth us going 30 minutes over, because I don't think we've had this kind of discussion in our press, or we've had this kind of discussion in our political environment. And I think it's important for them to begin to see this kind of guidance. Professor Brian?
Yeah, well, it would be not appropriate for me to